All right. Okay. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special talk of Akash Ganga. Today, we are proud to have Dr. Varun Bhalerao to give us a talk. Dr. Bhalerao is an astrophysicist at IIT Bombay, and his primary research is in the field of transient astronomical phenomena like supernovae, gamma ray bursts, and he also works in instrumentation and has worked on the astrosat and is also working on a future X-ray mission, Daksha. So after finishing his undergrad from IIT Bombay, he did his master's and PhD from Caltech, where he worked on the X-ray telescope New Star. And after that, he did his postdoc at IUCAA, and currently he's a professor at IIT Bombay. Sir has won numerous accolades, and he's also an associate of the Indian Academy of Sciences and has also won the Venu Bappu Gold Medal, which is the highest honor given by the Astronomical Society of India. Sir is also one of the leaders in the Indian effort to look for electromagnetic counterparts to gravitational wave sources. So with this short introduction, I'll let Sir begin his talk on how to tame the transient sky. So you can begin.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I hope you're all doing well. So today what we are going to talk about is how to tame the transient sky. So as soon as I get my screen shared, what I will of course have to start with is explaining what exactly is it that I mean by the transient sky at all. Okay, so usually when we go out and look at the sky, it looks pretty and you sit there and stare at it for a while and then you kind of get bored because the sky pretty much does nothing, right? So here I am showing you a beautiful montage of the Milky Way rising behind the Growth India telescope, and you'll probably be liking it, I hope. But if I had just shown you the same thing as a still photo while I was talking about all of this, you would just be bored, right? And we have a lot of mythological constructs around this as well. We think of the universe as unchanging, something that has been static and has been constant for a long, long time. That is not completely true. The universe is a highly, highly dynamic place. So I'm now going to show you another video, and this is the only video where I would really have liked to have a sound playing. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a montage made from images taken by the Canada France Hawaii telescope. And you can see that there are a few markers that are popping up here and there. Okay, so you'll notice that there were yellow markers popping up here, and now there are blue markers and so on. So this is a fast forwarded video of about 3 years of data. And what it shows you, if you look at any of the markers, is that with the marker, there's a new star that appears in that field. And then that star slowly fades out over time and then disappears. Okay, so what's interesting to note here is that all these small points you're seeing, they are all actually, most of them are galaxies. And some of these galaxies are faint that they are barely visible in these images, but then suddenly they become bright when one of these supernovae pops up over there. So what you are seeing is what is called a supernova explosion. And I would strongly encourage that we'll post a link of this with the recording, but you should go to this site. And what has been done here is that the sound, the explosions of the supernovae have been converted into a piano music, and it's really great to listen to, but Google Meet doesn't allow us to share audio. Okay, so what you see here is that there were hundreds of explosions that happened in these images, and you see that the area of the sky that is observed is quite small. It would be about this size. If you just stretch your hand out, it would block less than your fist on the entire sky. So what are these supernovae explosions? Well, here's another one. Let me show you a more detailed thing now. So this is a galaxy which is 80 million light years away. You can now, as opposed to the previous images where the galaxies were very far away and appearing as single small points. So what we are going to show you now is a video taken over many, many days of a supernova explosion in that galaxy. Okay, and I've still not talked about what supernova are. We'll come to that in a moment. But what you will see here is that in this galaxy, in a rather quiet part of the galaxy, suddenly you will see that something becomes extremely bright and then fades out again. So here it's marked with a circle for your convenience, and there you see it. There's nothing in the circle at the start, and then suddenly you had a very bright star that popped up. So if we go back over here, so you can see that the circle which is at this point seems empty. There is no bright source in it. And you can see the date up here. This is the 22nd of February 2015. Now let's play the movie. And suddenly you see that within a matter of few days, this thing becomes extremely bright, then stays bright for a few days, a few weeks actually. And typically on a time scale of 1 to 2 months, this fades out. So here's a close up again. There are no bright stars there. And here you see suddenly a very bright explosion. In fact, it's saturating the scale that has been used here for plotting. This is a massive explosion in the universe, and the universe is full of these kind of changes, very drastic events that keep happening. And this is what a transient is. So transient is nothing but a source which exists for a small amount of time in the sky, small amount by cosmological timescales. So something that is visible for a few months is a transient, as well as something that is visible for a few milliseconds is also a transient. So what are supernovae? Well, suppose you have a very, very massive star, something that is say 10 times heavier than the sun, 50 times heavier than the sun. Then at the end of its life, what is going to happen is that, so reason why the star is this giant ball of plasma is that at the center you are generating heat, and that heat is fighting against gravity. When in the end there is no more fusion happening at the core, all the material has been burnt out. What happens is that the star starts collapsing, and this collapse actually releases a phenomenal amount of energy, blowing up the entire star. And this explosion itself, in the matter of that month, it emits actually at its peak, it can outshine an entire galaxy, emits enormous amount of energy during that supernova explosion. And these supernovae explosions are because they are so bright. If you remember the first CFHT 4-frame animation, then the galaxy itself was hardly visible. And at the peak, it suddenly became much, much brighter. So the supernova can outshine an entire galaxy. The star, which lived for a few million years, the main core collapse part of it happens in a matter of tens of milliseconds. And then the entire explosion is visible for a matter of maybe a couple of months. That's it. So you can see that things which seem unchanging for a very long time scale can actually then end very quickly. Now, one important factor here is that if I start looking at a single given star, I'm not going to be around for a million years or a billion years to watch it die. But what I can do is I can look at millions or billions of stars, and then every now and then I'll see a few die, a few stars exploding. And that is how we actually start observing transients, and we start studying transients. Supernovae are not the most extreme objects. Within them, there can be even more extreme beasts. So there is something called a gamma ray burst. So here's another star. This is a blue supergiant, and it's going to explode as a supernova, but in what is called a hypernova. So during the explosion, what we will see is that it can actually launch massive jets. So the star would, as seen here, would be rotating in this direction. This would be the pole of the star, and the other pole would be back here. And as this star actually explodes along the rotation axis, it can launch highly energetic jets. So you'll see that the jet is being actually fired out, and those jets are moving at highly relativistic speeds. There are particles that are moving out there almost at the speed of light. And if you happen to be along that jet, if that jet happens to be pointed towards Earth, then you would see what is called a gamma ray burst. And after this GRB or a gamma ray burst, what is left at the center is a black hole. And you can see that there is, if you were looking from far away, you would see the bright flash of light. So observers along that axis, along the jet, would see a GRB. From everywhere else, you would see a regular supernova, a bright supernova possibly. But along that axis, this is so bright that you can see them across the universe, all the way across the universe. These have been, in fact, named mini Big Bangs, because the only explosion that we know of that released more energy than these gamma ray bursts is the Big Bang itself that led to the formation of the entire universe. What else do we have? Well, everybody likes black holes. So let's look at black holes. What can happen is that space is dangerous, right? we've all heard and seen of black holes in various contexts. You have probably seen movies like Interstellar, where the actors actually end up going close to a black hole, inside a black hole. Let's leave science fiction aside. I'm going to show you an animation here of what happens when a star goes too close to a black hole. Okay, so I have this animation has a star, a black hole, a star is going to get close to it, and the star gets ripped apart by the gravity of the black hole. And this is a real simulation. So this is based on our current best understanding of how these things happen. I want you to pay attention to the tip of this arrow, because that is where the action will begin. So let's look at this. And what we will see is at that point there is a star, and the black hole itself is dark and black, and that is not going to be seen. It refuses to play the video. That is quite unfortunate. I'm sorry, we'll just have to skip that. Google Meets interface is giving me issues which I had not anticipated before. Okay, I'll just tell you what would have happened. The star, when it passes close to the black hole, what happens is what is called a tidal force. So just as you have tides on Earth, where the moon is pulling on the Earth, and the water that is closest to the moon, you actually get a high tide, and then 90 degrees from that, you get low tides. Similarly, you would excite tides on the star, except that they would be so strong that the star just gets completely stretched apart. And then because it is no longer a star, it is now a cloud. That cloud then keeps orbiting this black hole. Part of the gas falls into the black hole. It is utter chaos. And these events can actually be seen from Earth. Okay, and here's what I really like. This is my current main area of work: neutron star mergers. I'm sure you have all heard about gravitational waves and about LIGO. So the direct detection of gravitational waves, this was a prediction by Einstein more than 100 years ago. The first direct evidence came in 2015 when LIGO detected the merger of two black holes. And then on 17th of August 2017, we saw another event, which is the animation that I'm going to show you here, which was the merger of two neutron stars. Okay, so what are shown in blue here are two neutron stars. Neutron star, you can think of it as a giant atom. How giant? It has the mass of about 1.5 to 2 times the mass of the sun, but it is made almost entirely of neutrons. So it is smaller than the city of Mumbai, for instance. A neutron star has a diameter of about 25 kilometers or so. Okay, so extremely compact. A spoonful of that would weigh more than a mountain. Extremely dense matter. And when these neutron stars can be found from supernova explosions, but what I'll show you here is two neutron stars that are orbiting each other. They also lose energy by emitting gravitational waves. And as that happens, unlike black holes, when the two neutron stars finally collide, what happens is it also releases a large amount of electromagnetic radiation. So let's see this animation. So you have over here two neutron stars. What is shown as blue waves propagating out are gravitational waves. They would not actually look blue. Gravitational waves are not light. And here finally there's a merger and massive explosion. Again, jets have been created. Now, why do we care about all of these things? Of course, they look cool. It's fun. But there is something that is far more fundamental about these transients. What happens in a transient is that you're often taking an astrophysical object and turning it inside out. You're ripping it apart. That's our only chance to look inside these objects in some form or the other and try to understand what is in there. So it is not very different from, say, trying to disassemble a radio to see how it works. Okay. What is very unique about astrophysics is that although we are an experimental science, we have almost no control over our experiments. I cannot say like a Diwali fataka, I can't light a fuse on a star and make it explode and say, let me see how supernovae work. We just have to wait for things to happen. And that is where these transients come in, and that is where we actually get to learn a lot about the universe. Now, starting from a static conceptual universe, we have come a long way. We have looked at a few transients, but the universe actually provides a lot more than this. There's an entire zoo of transients out there. And you can almost think of it as if the universe has given you all you can eat buffet, saying, you know, all of these transients are here, you go take whatever you want. Okay, and if you are thinking of this as a buffet, then of course there are rules that you follow for a buffet, right? So if you are ever thinking of, especially as students, how we used to do it in our hostel days, for example, is that you want to make sure that there are some basic things you are taking care of. You never go alone. It's more fun when you bring friends with you. The next thing is that you don't actually go there after a heavy meal, right? We used to make sure that lunch be light kiya so that we'll have a great dinner buffet. You then want to focus on your favorites. You don't want to fill yourself up on some random sabzi when you could have been eating a lot of cake instead. So you focus on few very specific things. And then the last one is a bit trickier, which is that you want to eliminate routine tasks. So once you have eaten your gulab jamun, you don't go get up and bring it yourself. You tell your friend, "Ek aur leke aana." Same thing works when we are trying to study transients as well. How? So the first thing is that you want to make sure you are working with a great team of people, great team of scientists. So we set up an international growth collaboration, and this right side, I'll talk to you in detail about all of them. Second is that just as you don't want a stomach which is already full of stuff, we don't want to use a telescope which is actually already busy, already observing, has a lot of things on its mind. So we actually decided to set up a dedicated telescope for this project. The next is, instead of focusing on this entire zoo of transients and trying to do everything, we don't want to do that. So we had key specific science goals saying these are the things that we will study. In particular, we decided that we will study supernovae, we will study near-Earth asteroids, and we will study these neutron star mergers. Okay, and then finally eliminate routine tasks. So we want to automate things as much as possible. Okay, so let's look at this starting from growth itself. So about 7 years ago, a bunch of us from around the world, from 8 countries, actually came together and set up an international team called GROWTH. Now, GROWTH is an acronym. It stands for Global Relay of Observatories Watching Transients Happen. So what's this collaboration about? Well, if you want to study something rare, if you want to get an amazing opportunity, it's very much like trying to get one of these Nat Geo level photographs, right? So how do you get a photograph like this? Well, it has some key aspects that you have to keep in mind. Okay, the challenge that we have when we want to follow up and study these transient sources is that you have to be at the right place, you have to be at the right time, and you have to have the right equipment. Okay, so let me elaborate this a bit more. What do I mean by being at the right place? So here's a world map, and I've shown day and night based on some time of my choice. And those binoculars indicate some nominal places where we have some of the largest telescopes in the world. Okay. Now, suppose there's a transient that blows up somewhere in the sky over here. What do I mean a transient? Why am I showing something in the sky on the Earth map? So what it means is, if you look at the Earth from the direction of that source, what you would see is something like this. Okay. Now notice that I've strategically chosen it such that the transient was over India. It is nighttime in India. But all of these telescopes are actually in daytime. So you could have the best telescopes there, but you're not going to be able to observe anything. The sky is going to be bright blue. It's daytime. Okay, so you have to have a network which is covering everywhere. You have to have a telescope at the right place. What about observing at the right time? So back in the same example, suppose I have a transient here. Well, all the telescopes could in principle have observed it, but it's daytime. So no one can observe it at this point. Okay, so you have to be careful with both of these. And no single telescope, by virtue of being on Earth, can actually circumvent this. Actually, it turns out space telescopes cannot do it fully either. You need a set of space telescopes, but maybe some other day we'll chat about that. So here's what we came up with. Okay, GROWTH, Global Relay of Observatories Watching Transients Happen, a network of 17 telescopes, 15 institutes spread over 8 countries. And I'll tell you how this works. Okay, it works like a relay race, where we pass on our target to the next telescope. As is shown here, suppose we discover something with ZTF, which is the Zwicky Transient Facility in California. After that, as the target sets in California, we'll pass it on to Hawaii, then Japan, Taiwan. After Taiwan, we will, Japan, Taiwan, after which we'll come to India here, then go to Israel, followed by telescopes in the Canary Islands, and then passing back to the US. Okay, let's look at it in a bit better way. Okay, here what I'm pointing, what is shown on the map here are the locations of all the partner institutes in GROWTH. Okay, so these are not necessarily just, these are actually telescope sites. Yes, I have not marked institutes here. Okay, and imagine you are some source somewhere in the universe. So you are looking at the Earth rotating. This is what you would see. But remember that there is also day and night. So let's add that. So this, I've put the sun on the left side here so that on the right side you have nighttime. Now notice that first thing is that although you see a given telescope for half of the Earth's day, only for half of that time in this particular orientation is it actually in the dark. So right now, for instance, all the American telescopes are in daytime, so they are not useful. Was there a question? I guess not. Okay. So what you will notice though is that with the entire growth network, there is always some telescope which is visible to you and is in the night time, which means that you are visible to at least some telescope for that amount of time from our network. So we had this international network with the idea to make sure that we will always have some telescope which is ready and capable of observing any point in the sky. Okay, so the next thing that we have, am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
we can
sir.
hear you.
Okay, it seems that my PowerPoint has decided to freeze. So we need to check what exactly is going on here. All right, and then it actually jumped forward by many slides. Okay. Yeah, I have not used Google Meets as often in my presentation, so sorry about the technical issues here, but let's go here. Apart from the network of telescopes, a very important aspect of an international team like Growth is that it's also a network of minds. Okay, so what you see at the top is the early Growth team at IIT Bombay, along with students working on other projects as well. And at the bottom is another picture from IIT Bombay again, but this shows the international growth collaboration. We had representatives from all countries visiting for the first school that we conducted at IIT Bombay actually. So all people pooling their resources, pooling their ideas, pooling their expertise is what can actually do wonderful, give wonderful results in research. Okay, so now let's get to the next point. We said right place, right time. So we want to be at every place at all the time. That solves that issue. But we want the right equipment. We want to have a wide field telescope with a large aperture so that it's very sensitive, and we should be able to respond fast. By fast, I mean we want to respond on timescales of minutes, and we should be able to monitor things regularly. And that also means you don't want a human in the loop. The first time you get a call at 4 a.m. saying, oh, there's a new gamma ray burst, can you point your telescopes to study it? You are very excited. You wake up, you call up the observatory, you make sure observations get done. The second time it happens, you are maybe still excited. The 20th time it happens, you are like, "Arey yaar, phone snooze karke so jate hai." Okay, so putting a human in the loop, there are chances for mistakes. There is a slower response. There is fatigue. You are not the sharpest when you are just woken up from sleep. So we want to eliminate that and automate as many things as possible, right? Automate the routine tasks. So this is the Growth India telescope. This is a 70 centimeter telescope that is the size of the primary mirror over here. We don't use lenses, we have a mirror. And this is our camera. Some very curious things. So this was funded, by the way, by the government, Department of Science and Technology and the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum. You'll notice that I have called it a 4K by 4K camera here. That's 16 megapixels. Several of you might have phones today that have 16 megapixels cameras. Okay, but this camera is far more sensitive than those and costs about 100 or 1,000 times more than the camera part of your phone. Okay, so very sensitive state-of-the-art camera, very rapid response telescope, can point to anywhere in the sky within 10 seconds. And this combination gives us a wide field of view. So what do I mean by wide field of view? Well, let's start with something that we have a good intuition about. You all have seen the full moon in the night sky. So here's the full moon, and I'll show you some how much of the sky can a telescope image. Okay, so this is these are some of the research telescopes in India. This is a 1.2 meter telescope at Mount Abu that covers about this red square, red rectangle that you see here. The Himalayan Chandra telescope has a larger instrument, so that can cover about this much. The largest telescope in the country right now is the 3.6 meter Devasthal telescope. It was set up only a couple of years ago, and that has this large field of view. As compared to all of this, here is the field of view of the Growth India telescope. So by design, we are a smaller telescope, but with a large field of view, so we can see much larger parts of the sky in a single shot. So it will take about 10 images from the Devasthal telescope to cover as much area as we can in a single image. Okay. Here's a nice picture of the telescope itself mounted in the dome. You'll notice that the dome is not a comfortable place because it is not meant to have people inside it at night. There's only a small rickety table on the side and the telescope itself sitting inside. You'll also notice that it is pointing away from the opening. Daytime sky is too bright. We don't want that light directly shining on our telescope or camera. Here's a picture of the site itself, the wonderful location at Hanle. Extremely pristine place, very, very nice and clear skies. About 2 years ago, in June 2018, was the first time that we actually took images from the telescope. So this is a photo, you may have seen some variant of this photo. The most popular picture of these pillars of creation is a blue-yellow looking photo from the Hubble Space Telescope. Okay, so this is our raw image. Without absolutely any processing done onto it, and I've given our Growth India website here, and you can go and look at a lot more pictures of the site. We have some videos of the installation process. We have more pictures taken using the telescope and camera. So this is our first light image. Now, if you are looking at transients, then pointing your telescope is sounds simple, but there is a lot that has to happen behind the scenes to do this. Okay, so the first thing we talk about is something called the trigger. Okay, so somebody has to tell you that this is an interesting transient, you should look at it. Why can you not search for it yourself? Let's go back to the buffet analogy. There is always someone who goes and eats everything, and at the end of it, they have not enjoyed anything, right? But they'll come and tell you, "Arey, aaj gulab jam acha nahi hai, jalebi zyada khao." So you rely on them and you do the follow-up. Okay, speaking in more scientific terms, there are survey telescopes which are designed to survey the sky and look for transients. And then there are what are called follow-up telescopes, which will actually study those transients in more detail. The analogy is quite reasonably stretched to the buffet, by the way. So you get a trigger, and after the trigger, you have to come up with an observing plan. Do you want to observe in a single filter? Do you want to take multiple types of images? How long do you want your exposures to be? How sensitive should your image be? And so on. After the plan, you also have to worry about coordinating your observations in a network like Growth. How much data should I take from India? I have to make sure that after me, Israelis are ready to observe. After that, Canary Islands are ready to observe, and so on. So there is a coordination aspect that comes in. Then you have an image taken from your telescope, but that's not it, right? You have to first pre-process the image to make it useful. And then I give you a picture, something that looks like the previous slide, a beautiful picture of the sky. That doesn't tell you which star in that is the supernova. What is the new source there? So you have to have what are called reference images, older images taken of the same location, and you compare your new images with those. Okay, and after that comparison, you then try to detect transients. Once you have found the transient, it turns out that there are a lot of false positives. So there are a lot of things that may seem astrophysical but are not really. A simple example is that if a plane flew past my field of view while I was taking the image, or if there's a satellite, then those can look like false positives. So you have to get rid of them. And finally, we have to have a human verification step. But all of these steps, okay, starting after the trigger, this is not something that I need to sit down and make a timetable manually. I can have a computer code that actually does this in an optimal way. I can have schedulers that can, so in fact, I published a paper with an IISER Pune student several years ago about how to come up with these plans and how to coordinate observations. These image processing steps are standard, transient detection, and to some extent even this, these are all steps that can be automated. Okay, and that brings us to a very important point here. Our philosophy in this was to make sure that the repetitive tasks are actually left to computers. Our goal was on the science. Okay, so which is why, for example, we decided not to build a telescope. We actually bought a telescope. We bought an off-shelf telescope as large as was available at that time. And we said, okay, let us focus on the scientific output. We know how to make a telescope. There's nothing left to be proven there. Okay, and you do not need a scientist to just press keys at 4 a.m. You need a scientist for the creative part of science. He or she has to then look at the data and interpret it. You have to understand what is happening. That is what your computer cannot do. And that is entirely what our effort in the last 3-4 years on Growth India has been about. We have tried to take every single step and seen, can this be automated? Does this really need a human in the loop? Because if you are sleeping better, you are happier, you can do your science more creatively, you are spending more of your time on things that matter. And that is what has driven us completely. And that is actually also what has given us great results. Because if you look at all the research telescopes in the country, Growth India is among the smallest. It's the second smallest actually. And in terms of productivity, we are the second best producer of research results. Okay, and I'll show you some of our results as we go ahead. So a curious aside here is this. So the person you see reflected in the laptop here is Sujay Mate, who at that time was a ICER Pune student. And this is a project that was done. This was a predecessor to Growth. What is being shown here is there are two laptops. This one is called the server, as you can read here. And he is going to give a command on the server. And once that command is given, you'll see a telescope that actually starts moving by itself. Okay, so this was even before Growth as a project existed. I think Sujay is in the audience. I saw him at the start. So this was the predecessor of what became all of our automation codes. So here's the command that has been sent, and you can see that the command was actually accepted, and you can see the telescope has slowly started moving. You'll also notice that the telescope is inside the room. This was simply meant to be a proof of concept. Okay, so we have good connections with ICER Pune on this. Starting from this simple flowchart and our first pass ideas here, things became a lot more sophisticated as we went along. So instead of that flowchart, we now have a far more complicated flowchart. Our workflow involves a lot of things. I'll just leave it on the screen. I don't expect you to read all of it, but essentially the idea is that we have a control computer sitting at Hanle, and we have another machine sitting here at IIT Bombay. And the IIT Bombay machine monitors the internet for machine readable transient notices. We then send commands through Bangalore via a satellite link to Hanle. Then the telescope there can start working by itself. Data are compressed, sent back to IIT Bombay, processed with extremely high-end algorithms that are being used. We are also looking into implementing some machine learning and artificial intelligence-based algorithms for making our job even more. It's when I say easier, I also mean that it is robust. We have fully reproducible results and so on. So extremely complicated, but a lot of this work, by the way, was done by undergraduate students. Okay, so there's one PhD student at IIT, a couple of PhD students at Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bangalore, one postdoctoral fellow, but everyone else working on this were undergraduates. Okay, so here's, instead of looking at that complicated flowchart, let me give you a very quick overview. Okay, and in the daytime, we sit and make a list of targets. And tonight we want to observe A, B, C. Okay, we don't even bother making a list of what time we should observe what. If we have something critical saying this must happen at exactly 10:35 p.m., we can specify that as well. And we then upload that list to the control computer at Hanle, and we are done. Okay, in the evening, the telescope automatically starts observations. As the data comes in, that data is automatically downloaded, processed, image processing is done, everything is done. And when we come back to office in the morning, we directly start looking at the final numbers. Okay, and we can start working on interpreting the data. That is the level of automation that we have attained, and that is what has given us fantastic outcomes. Okay, so finally I've been talking of outcomes, so let's talk about what we ate at this buffet, right? Or what we saw with Growth India telescope. But just dekha is also not enough. So what? So what we really want to talk about is what we learned about the universe by using the Growth India telescope. All right, and before going to that, let me introduce the current team. This has people from IIT Bombay. We of course have a great team from Indian Institute of Astrophysics as well. People here are working on GIT and on other projects like Daksha and AstroSat with me. So everyone, please say hi. This is hi back from all of us. So remember these neutron star mergers that I talked about? So let's, when these two neutron stars come in, they're emitting gravitational waves detected by LIGO, and then the merger itself emits X-rays, gamma rays, optical light, and everything. Okay, so this is my main area of research. This is what I work on. What I did not talk about is that all of this debris which you saw created over here, that has something very, very special. Okay, it creates some elements which all of us tend to like a lot. In particular, particular, it creates actually all the gold in the universe. So one would think that being made of carbon, we actually like carbon the most or oxygen in the air, but somehow we end up liking gold more. All the gold in the universe was actually made by neutron stars colliding with each other. Okay, gold, silver, platinum, all of these very heavy elements were synthesized by mergers of neutron stars. So it's questions like these that we are trying to address by studying these sources. Okay, so after the commissioning of the Growth India telescope, after the telescope became functional 2 years ago, LIGO had an observing run called O3A, and they had a run called O3. They have released the results of the first part of this run called O3A, and there were 10 events that actually had a neutron star merger or a neutron star black hole merger. Now what are shown here are sky maps obtained by LIGO. Okay, so if you look at this in this sky map, there's a very sharp spot seen over here, whereas in these maps there are often these large stretched regions. So LIGO cannot pinpoint where a source is on the sky. The way LIGO localizes a source is very similar as to how your ears function. So suppose you are sitting somewhere and you hear an airplane, right? Quite commonly, you will be able to say that, okay, it passed somewhere there in the sky. You won't be able to tell exactly where it is. And the way your brain figures out where it is based on the frequency of the source. It can either actually calculate the phase difference or the time delay between sound incident on your left ear and on your right ear. Okay, so LIGO works on a very similar principle. Multiple LIGO detectors have to be functional, and then based on the delay on the signal detection between these different LIGO interferometers, we can actually figure out where the source is on the sky. And just as you cannot pinpoint a source, LIGO cannot either. Okay. Out of these 10 sources, these 6 were studied in great detail by LIGO, by Growth India telescope as well. And I'm going to focus in particular on this event. Okay, so let me show you a close-up. So what I've done here is, again, this is a map of the entire sky. So think of it like a globe, but for the sky. And what is shown here in red is roughly where the source should be. Okay, so if it's a darker red color, it means that it's more likely that the signal came from there. Okay, this sounds quite odd, right? We are used to seeing a star is there. Okay, but again, think it will help if you think of it more as if you have heard a sound, you know somewhere where it is, you can say, okay, it is more likely to be in this direction as opposed to this direction. So this is what LIGO can calculate. And when this event happened, okay, this large part of the sky, within the collaboration, we decided how to coordinate. This part which I have marked was to be covered by the Californian friends, the Zwicky Transient Facility. There's a small blob here that was covered by another partner telescope called DECAM. And this little square around the North Pole was what the Growth India telescope will cover. Note that although the area is small, it actually has the most likely chance that the source will actually be located there. And what I've shown on the right here is the part of this which we actually imaged is shown with this dark overlay. Okay, so let's try to put this in context again. So this is the part of the sky that we imaged. The border is very jagged because we took images over 10 days with different orientations of the camera. This was one particular source slightly outside the central region which we imaged. So this square here shows you our field of view. For reference, since we don't intuitively know what 5 degrees really translates to, this green dot which has just appeared, this is how large the full moon would be. And then the small black dot below the green dot, that's the typical field of view of a typical telescope. Okay, so with this telescope, if you had to cover this entire region, it would take forever. Remember that the explosion itself is going to fade with time. So you don't have forever to keep looking at those sources. So what we did was we took data for 10 nights, and individual sources, individual fields are shown here. So we covered this part on the first night, this part on the second night, then we split up our observations and so on. So we obtained a lot of images. Then we had to go through processing all of those. When we first did the image subtraction, we found actually something like 20 crore candidates. And then that had to be filtered down. A lot of people manually checked the data. There were significant steps of visual inspection. Machine learning codes were not yet ready for this. And then finally, out of those millions and millions of sources in our fields, we came down to a list of 5 sources. Okay, so in those 10 days, there were 5 genuine new sources that had popped up in that part of the sky. Here are pictures of those. So this is our image, the first one called Science. This is a reference image, so an older image taken by a different telescope. You subtract these two and a bright source is left. So what this is telling you is that this point has become significantly brighter than what used to be. You will note that this one has, after subtraction, completely disappeared. Similarly here, you will see that there is a source here which after subtraction completely disappears, but a faint fuzz here is still present, and so on until we have these 5 sources. What is plotted on the right side, okay, these red dots over here are showing you the brightness of these sources, and the x-axis is time in days. So starting at 0 days, going up to 15 days. And you'll notice that these sources remained uniformly bright, or this one actually became slightly brighter over time. And these bands which are shown here are the kind of expectation that you have theoretically from what should happen with a neutron star merger. Okay, so what this tells us is that none of these can actually have been the actual counterpart to a neutron star merger. You'll say, wait a minute, you looked at that point, there was a signal from LIGO and you found something else. Yeah, remember the first animation that I showed you again? There were a lot of supernovae in that small part of the sky. So, and there is the universe is full of transients. If you're looking hard enough and you're using the right technologies, you'll see them. So we found all of these other transients. Unfortunately, none of them were actually related to the gravitational wave event. That also matters. Okay, so these non-detections, what it tells us is, so what is now shown here is that, okay, let us assume that there was actually an event. There was something which was too faint for us to see. Okay, so you see a lot of red symbols here. And what this is saying is that any source that could have been present there must have been fainter than these. Okay, and again theoretical models are plotted. So let us look at, say, this particular thing. There's an orange theoretical model which says that between 1 to 2 days the source will become really bright, and we observed the entire area and we did not see anything to about this brightness level. So what this is telling you is that we can rule out this model. We can say that definitely this was not the kind of explosion that happened. All right, so enough of binary neutron stars. Let's move to something else. Okay, and this is the closing part of my talk. The last thing we are going to talk about today is asteroids. So I'm sure all of you have heard about something called the asteroid belt, a belt of rocky objects floating around in the solar system between Mars and Jupiter. There are a lot of asteroids known, but what I'm showing in this animation is near Earth asteroids. Okay, so you'll see that at the center is the sun. This white thing is the orbit of Earth, and red is the orbit of Mars. And as of 2018, there are a lot of asteroids that are close to Earth. Okay, this brown band outside here is the main asteroid belt, and you'll see that there are huge number of asteroids there. But there is a significant number of asteroids that actually can pass quite close to Earth. And that is something we need to take very, very seriously. Why so? Well, let's rewind a few million years. Nice clear day, blue skies, looking down at the horizon, you're happily having these creatures known as dinosaurs roaming around. But then suddenly there was an asteroid which impacted and completely annihilated dinosaurs, right? So caused a mass extinction event. Most of the living species at that time were extinct because an asteroid impacted Earth and wreaked havoc. So now we have to be aware of these things. We have to be careful about these things. And these features are not as rare as we might think. Small rocks enter the Earth's atmosphere at all times, and the atmosphere, they usually burn up in the atmosphere. We see them as meteors. Here, let me show you an impact of an object on the moon. Okay, so look at the video here, and there was a bright flash that you saw at this point. Okay, so let me rewind this and show it to you again. There you have it. Suddenly a part of the moon became bright and faded out again. Here's a close-up photograph of that region, and you see this bright crater that has been formed here. Okay, so this impactor was a small 1-foot size rock that was about 40 kilograms weight, and the energy of the impact was about 5 tons equivalent of TNT, and it created a crater that was about 60 feet across. Okay, that's huge. Fortunately, a rock of this size would burn up completely in the Earth's atmosphere. But we could have larger rocks. So here's an event from February 2013. there was a large fireball that was seen. So these are actually camera videos from Russia in a place called Chelyabinsk. And you see that this thing became completely bright, so bright that it is outshining everything else, large trails created. And in fact, you will notice that so people are running in panic, windows got blown in. This was all happening because of the impact of this meteor. Okay, you can see a lot of damage was caused. This was something that weighed about 12,000 tons, and it released about 25 to 30 times the energy of the nuclear bomb that had been dropped at Hiroshima. Okay, this is in recent history. We are talking about 2013. Okay, and this was again by universal standards not very large. It was a 20-meter size rock. It exploded in the atmosphere, fragments fell to the ground, they were recovered, but the energy released was about 25 to 30 times more than the nuke that was dropped at Hiroshima during the World War. Okay, to give you a context as to why this is a small asteroid, well, here's a bunch of rocks that we'll see, known objects. So this is about 4.1 meters in diameter. And then the next one that is being shown here, this is about the size of that Chelyabinsk meteor. And here are a bunch of other asteroids that we know of. Okay, so 30 meters in diameter, that's larger than a house. But then you can keep going on and on and on. There are, Apophis is something which media keeps talking about. This is about 370, so as tall as Eiffel Tower. And then if you start going on, you have asteroids which are kilometers or larger in size. Okay, if any of these were to hit Earth, they have the potential to wipe out civilization. So we start worrying about large scale damage for asteroids which are about 140 meters or larger in size. So what are we doing? Why am I talking about this? Well, we want to study these. NEO stands for near Earth object. We want to make sure that we are actually observing the sky. We are keeping an eye out for them. We want to know where they are. And if we see any of them, then we have a top secret plan about what to do. Oops, I was not supposed to show that. Well, there are more serious plans that are in place about deflecting asteroids, about getting them away, and how we can actually alter their trajectories. But the key to all of this is early detection. We need to find an asteroid almost 10 years or so before it's going to impact Earth if we want to have any chance of deflecting it. And Growth India is a very nicely placed telescope for this. In fact, here I would like to mention this. Three of our students, so two undergraduates and a PhD student, last year won the New Discovery Award, won a special mention, sorry, not the award. They were given a special mention in the New Discovery Award of the Astronomical Society of India for their work on searching and studying asteroids with the Growth India telescope. Among their achievements, one of them was the discovery of 2020 QG. This was done in partnership with the Zwicky Transient Facility. This was an asteroid that flew past Earth without impacting the Earth, and at that time, this was the closest known asteroid. Since then, two more have been discovered which passed closer. One of them was discovered again by the same team. So a lot of work has been done. This received a lot of press coverage as well in any of these news outlets. You might know several of them. Here are a few news clips that made about this. Okay, but here are actual images of asteroids taken with our telescope. Okay, so this is an asteroid Gault. This was an observing campaign that we undertook along with several partner telescopes in the Growth collaboration. What you see is along with the green circle, the asteroid is actually moving. Okay, so first is this image has been inverted, okay, because perceptually that makes it easier to see things. So black spots that you see are stars, except for the one with the green circle, that's the asteroid. And the asteroid, because it is orbiting the sun, appears to move against the background stars. Now, imagine if I had taken a very long exposure. If you want to see fainter things, then we take our cameras and we take very long exposure, just as the night mode of your camera. You'll have noticed that night mode, if you move your cell phone, then it actually blurs the image. That's because you are taking a much longer exposure. If I had taken a very long exposure of this, then instead of seeing the asteroid as a dot, I would have seen the asteroid as a long streak here. In such cases, what we do is we know what object we are tracking. So we actually move our camera with that. Just as if you want to image, you will have seen pictures of maybe race cars where the camera is actually following the car. So things in the background appear blurred. So here's an example of another asteroid, 2020 UA1. The designations just refer to the year it was discovered and so on. I won't go into nomenclature. And what you see here now are the asteroid is appearing as a point, and all the streaks behind are all stars. Okay, so what's happening is we are moving our telescope and camera with the asteroid, and as a result, and you can see the timestamps here. By the way, these images are all separated by about 2 to 3 minutes, and you can see that the stars are all appearing as streaks in this. Okay, so by taking images like these, we can actually calculate the orbits of the asteroid. We can figure out how close it's going to pass to Earth and so on. Again, this work is led by an undergraduate student here, and we are writing up a paper about this as well. So let's see who all did it. So I mentioned Sujay Mate's name in the early, in one of those predecessor of growth demonstrations. There were also other students, Atharva and Sumit from IISER Pune, who were involved in the early efforts. Later at IIT Bombay, a lot of project students and undergraduates took it up. There's of course a great team at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics along with this, but I'm not including their names here. But you'll notice that the largest list here is actually undergraduate students. There's one PhD student here, two PhD students at IA, one postdoc, and everyone else is all undergraduate student. Okay, and what did they do? Well, in the last 3 years, we have 7 refereed publications. 4 of them actually have undergraduate students as co-authors. There are 4 more that are under review. We have followed up more than 100 objects. And in fact, just one of the students has, Kriti has 104 minor planet electronic circulars. We have published astronomers telegrams. We have published GCN circulars studying GRBs and so on, and many, many more are coming up. Right? So that's to tell you that if you have a dedicated team that's working hard on something, then you can actually achieve fantastic results. All right, so I'll end with that. It brings us to the end of our slot, and we can take any questions.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful talk. So now we can take the questions. I'll first, if anyone wants to unmute and just ask, they can do that. Okay.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. So, so I wanted to ask you that you said that the basic when we take the stars observation, when we fix the coordinates and everything. So I wanted to understand that the trigger thing that happens, the first observation, how do you take that, right? We do have the set of stars which rotate among the around the world with the coordination of the team, but how do you take that first observation? How do you know that we have?
So there are 2 ways in which we decide what we want to observe. The first is that there's a network of space telescopes as well. In fact, one of the projects that I lead is called Daksha, where we are going to build another set of space telescopes which actually look for X-ray and gamma ray explosions in the sky. Okay, and they can then tell us that X-ray explosion was just detected in this part of the sky, and then we can start pointing our telescopes there. Or we can have LIGO, which gives us this gravitational wave localization, saying something happened right now, go start looking for optical light coming from that. So that is one type. The second type is that within the growth network itself, ZTF, the Zwicky Transient Facility, is that chap who goes and eats everything in a buffet and tells you what's worth eating. Okay, so they have a much larger field of view actually as compared to even Growth India telescope, and they will undertake these first observations and tell us which are the interesting things that are worth following up in greater detail.
I understand. So one more question. I think the last question that I have, that through this growth network telescope that we have in India, can we see the planets in the moon, or is it too bright for the telescope to observe?
The moon is way too bright for the telescope to observe. Okay. We can see the planets. We have not bothered looking at them. That's not completely true. We took some test images of Jupiter when we were commissioning the telescope. Okay. But basically, you don't want to take an army to kill a cockroach. Okay, you don't need a very large telescope to just take pretty pictures of the moon or planets. We could do some planetary science with this, but our team also focused on the 3 best tasting items in the buffet. So there are a lot more things that Growth India telescope is capable of doing, but which are not part of our core purview. So we don't take those up.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so in the chat, there is a question by Kiran Mehta. In photographs where every dot appears to be a star but is actually a galaxy, how is the latter discerned?
That is a very good question. So, from a single photograph, you can tell it only if the galaxy actually appears elongated. Okay, so in one of the supernova animations that I showed you, you could see a nice S-shaped galaxy. That's a very obvious galaxy. Now, imagine that galaxy is further and further away from you until at some point you will no longer see it as a very clear spiral galaxy, but it will still appear fuzzy. It will still appear as if it is not a point source, and at that point you can still figure out that this is not likely a star, because a star will have a very specific thing we call a point spread function, so it will look like a point source. Beyond that, if the galaxy is even further away such that it is smaller than what is called the resolution of your telescope, that's just like your screen's resolution or camera's resolution. If it is smaller than that, then you can't figure out directly. Then there are two other tricks which we can use. We can take a spectrum of that object, and the spectrum of a galaxy and the spectrum of a star looks very different. The other thing that we can do is, instead of a spectrum, we can actually take images in what are called different filters. And based on the magnitudes in different filters, we can try to classify whether it is a galaxy or a star.
Okay, so another question by Kiran Mehta. Will a black hole and a regular star merger be able to produce detectable gravitational waves?
Okay, so everything makes gravitational waves. I've been waving my hands throughout this talk. That is also producing gravitational waves. So as you have very rightly asked the question, it is about detectable gravitational waves. So what makes it detectable? One part is obvious. My hand moving is clearly not generating as much gravitational waves as a black hole moving. So the amplitude is one part. But there is also another aspect, which is the frequency. Okay, so to give you an example from a different field, the human ear can hear sounds between 20 hertz to about 20 kilohertz. So if I make a sound at say a megahertz, you are not going to be able to hear it. Similarly, our current ground-based detectors detect gravitational waves from a frequency of about 10-20 hertz to few kilohertz. And a regular star and a black hole orbiting each other will produce gravitational waves at much lower frequencies. So those will not be detectable by our current detectors.
I'll just ask a follow-up. Would these be detectable by the LISA or lower frequency
Okay,
detectors?
so a main sequence star, what happens is that the frequency is so low that even LISA, it might be difficult. There it will be a combination of frequency and amplitude. But there are other sources like supermassive black holes orbiting each other will also be at lower frequencies. LISA can see those. Two white dwarfs orbiting each other will be detectable by LISA.
Even pulsar timing arrays could do that.
Pulsar timing arrays could possibly do black hole plus regular star, but there the amplitude will be too low.
Okay, so the next question by Mandar Potdar. What is the limiting magnitude of Growth India? Is it able to achieve over reasonable exposure time to capture and differentiate an asteroid?
Okay, so the faintest that we have seen with Growth India is actually 24th magnitude. We are very proud of it, but that took several hours of imaging. Our typical limiting magnitude in a 5 to 10 minute exposure is about 21st magnitude. Some of the asteroids I showed you, GALT was about 15th magnitude or so. So for bright asteroids, we can do it with 1 minute exposures. For fainter asteroids, we take longer exposures. Sometimes we have done more advanced techniques like track and stack and things like that. So, and this non-sidereal tracking, we are one of maybe a dozen telescopes around the world that actually do this routinely. And that allows us to go to fainter asteroids as well.
Right. And the next question is by Dhruv Nayak. Is the Growth Telescope data open access?
No, the Growth Telescope data is not open access. We have shared some sample data. So education and outreach is a large part of the Growth India collaboration. So the first ever growth school was actually held in India at IIT Bombay. This was in 2018. All the material from that, the sample data, the lecture videos, the Python notebooks that were used in tutorials, everything is online. And we have held 2 more growth schools since then, including a summer school held just last year in August. And all of that is also, so if you go to growth.caltech.edu, you will find all the material available there that includes sample data from the Growth India telescope as well. But the data is taken for very specific scientific purposes, and there's limited use that it could have outside that, but it is collaborations data. It is not public.
Okay. So Ankit Bhandari is asking, how can students get involved in Daksha?
In Daksha, okay. Well, there are two ways. You can be a project student, and if you so the correct way is to come join for a PhD in one of the partner institutes in Daksha. I've not talked much about Daksha, so let me tell you briefly. We have a proposal to build two X-ray gamma ray space telescopes. They will be built completely in India, and they will be about a factor of 10 more sensitive than the current best telescopes around the world. Okay, that includes space telescopes that are launched by NASA and ESA for this very specific task of detecting GRBs. Will be able to do 10 times better, and it's a consortium of many institutes. IUCA, IIT Bombay is leading it. There's PRL, TIFR, IUCA, RRI, and several ISRO centers. Okay, so go join there as either a project student or a PhD student. That's how you'll get involved.
Okay, Vikrant is asking for how long is the EM afterglow of the GW170817 visible, and usually how long can it go on for?
It depends on the band. So in optical, we saw it for a few weeks. In X-ray, the last detection was last year. In radio, we are still following it up, and it's still observable. So that's what close to 4 years almost now since the event. So it will go on for a while. It's getting fainter and fainter, that much harder to follow. But so far, that has been the only binary neutron star merger where we have an electromagnetic counterpart. So we are putting in a lot of efforts to actually study it. In fact, so the original follow-up paper that came from this, the original follow-up campaign, the publication that resulted out of it had 3,500 co-authors on it. Okay, with from 1,000 different institutes. So it's the largest effort, to my knowledge, in astronomy ever done. And to date, okay, it's been, as I said, close to 4 years since the event. There is still, on an average, one new research paper being published about that source per day. So because it is telling us so much, we are still continuing to follow it up with a lot of resources.
Okay, so Mandar Poddar is asking, is it possible to add smaller amateur telescopes to growth, like community extension, like folding at home? I'm not sure what.
We seriously considered this idea. So there are good amateur astronomy groups, and there are people who are what we call serious amateur astronomers who do very good quality imaging. And occasionally there are targets that they can follow. So we very seriously looked into it, but standardization becomes a big problem. For example, we use very specific filters, and those are usually expensive, so most people don't have them. Most of our targets are faint even for Growth India. So it's very rare that we have something brighter than 19th magnitude. So it's rather rare that we have something that is accessible to amateurs. Also, what happens is that when you are a partner telescope in the network, you want to be able to count on it, right? Think of it as if you're part of a team playing, say, cricket. You can't say कि हाँ, suddenly 12वें over के बाद मुझे bore हो गया तो जाके सो गए, right? If you are expected to be standing covering some position, you should be there. So that became another problem, that amateurs usually are going to be living in some light polluted area. They can't observe from there. So with all those factors put together, it finally ended up that we could not actually add amateur telescopes into the network. But there are existing bulletin boards and forums online where opportunities are available for smaller telescopes as well.
Neve, you are muted, I think.
Sorry. So how can you predict that these objects are these many light years away? I hope
that is among the hardest things to do in astronomy. Measuring distances is very difficult. We can't say that at a glance. I cover an entire lecture in my astronomy course on how to measure distances. So too detailed to give here.
So where is this course?
Oh, this is a IIT Bombay course.
Okay, fine.
I can just suggest that IUCA has this summer school where the initial lectures do have these concepts. So Anirban is asking, how do you detect near-Earth asteroids, how small they are, and how do you predict their orbits? Won't they be very dim?
Okay, so they are very dim. That is why it's very hard to detect them. But even if an object is intrinsically faint, if it comes closer to you, it appears brighter. So that is how we can detect them. We have seen them at all sorts of brightnesses. The orbit itself is calculated based on how it appears to move with respect to the background star. So there are known algorithms and known programs that will calculate the orbit. And the Minor Planet Center of the International Astronomical Union actually collates data from all people who have observed that target, and they are the ones who have the final verdict. They combine all the data, they put together the best orbits and so on. How do we detect it? The basic search is done by ZTF. Our team is involved in scanning and looking for candidates, and then finally, in special cases, we do follow-up imaging with the Growth India telescope as well.
Okay, Kaustubh is asking what factors would determine the field of view of the telescope? Is there a simple relation of the field of view with the size of the
Unfortunately,
lens?
okay. Unfortunately, no, there is no direct relation with the size of the lens. It actually depends more on the focal length of the telescope. And if you have a camera, then the field of view is given quite simply by tan inverse of the diameter of your camera divided by the focal length. But if you are looking at a telescope with a lens system, then it's a more tricky business, which has to do with the apparent field of the eyepiece and so on.
Okay, Amog is asking what is the minimum time required to make an observation after receiving a trigger, and more generally, what is the range of timescales of typical transients?
The fastest we have responded within the growth collaboration is within minutes, including for the Growth India telescope. Our aim is to respond even faster. So we are continuously tweaking our algorithms to go faster. The range of timescales for transients, well, in radio, there are something called fast radio bursts. They last for about a millisecond. Okay, whereas in optical, there are supernovae which can be bright for a couple of months. So broadly speaking, that's the range. There should be something I should point out in context. Okay, if there is an object which becomes bright, stays bright for 100 years and become faint again, then simply based on the human time scale, I wouldn't call it a transient, because to me it was always bright. So this time scale is contextual relative to human time scales.
Okay, Kiran is asking, is the AM follow-up to gravitational wave detections computationally intensive exercise?
So the image processing is computationally quite intensive right now, but not so much. Our work right now for the Growth India is at a scale where a modern PC can just about handle it in near real time. For larger cameras like the Zwicky transient facility, which is I think several hundred megapixel camera, we actually use a supercomputing cluster for doing that. So there we have to worry a lot about the algorithms and timescales.
Okay, Naveen is asking, how do you decide the interesting transient candidates from the whole buffet of Zwicky transient facility? Say if I'm interested in strongly lensed transients, how do we pick them?
So that is actually a very active research problem even now. There is no easy way to know a priori which transient is worth following up and which is not. Because how would you know, right? You've just seen one point, there's a new source. You have to spend a lot of resources to decide what the source is. So what we usually do is that we have some predefined criteria. For example, how fast it is becoming brighter or fainter. And then we compare those to known transients. For example, several thousand supernovae have been studied to date. So we have a reasonable idea what a typical supernova looks like. And if you are into supernovae, then we'll pass it on to you. Hey, here's what is a type 2p supernova. Go. I know you are interested in them. Go study it. Otherwise, we'll just skip past it. And people like me, we are often interested in the oddballs. So if something doesn't look like a known transient, then we'll go after it. So it is a tricky question, and it's an open research problem. There are papers that we are working on and publishing about how to find interesting transients.
Okay, Kiran is asking, where does growth use FPGAs?
We don't use FPGAs for growth. We will be using FPGAs a lot in Daksha though. So FPGAs, for those who don't know, are field programmable gate arrays. If you want to do some processing very fast in hardware, then you can use those.
Okay, I think this is the last question in the chat. Preksha is asking, are there any opportunities for students from non-partner institutes to work for growth? How can students get involved in this project?
Okay, so since this is the last question, maybe I will answer by giving you a website first, which is star-iitb.in. This is my group's website, and this question is answered in detail there. So opportunities for students. What happens is that we want to cater to as many students as possible. We want to give opportunities to as many students as possible, but we have finite resources. Okay, so we cannot inclusively involve everyone. We occasionally take interns from outside. The most common channel is that the 3 academies of science together run an internship program, and every year, so people apply to the academies, and through them candidates are shortlisted, and every year we take a few students from there. What you should do and can do is that you can learn a lot without actually joining the group. Okay, as I said, that is why we spent a lot of time, effort, and money in getting professional recording of the lectures that we took, and putting all that material online. The content was all designed so that you should be able to run it on your own laptops. All of those winter school videos and later summer school videos have been designed for that. There are also very good courses. One of our growth collaborators, Tara Murphy, teaches a course called Data Driven Astronomy that's present on Coursera. So there are a lot of resources which are available online for you to actually familiarize yourself with astronomy and understand more, right? And that is finally what the goal of an internship is. So even if you don't get an internship, don't lose heart. You will be able to do things, a lot of things by yourself online. And then those things, of course, are building your profile as well, right? That will tell you if you have the interest. Okay, so for example, I like listening to music. I don't have the patience to learn to play any instrument, and I sing horribly. Okay, so listening to music is great for me, but I won't try to become a musician. So if you are interested in astronomy, when you start seeing the math and the programming behind it, this will let you know if you really are interested in those parts as well. And if you are interested in that, and if you can successfully complete those, and then you approach someone, whether in growth or in any other partnership, then they'll say, okay, this student has a good background and has a good track record. It's very easy to say, it's very easy to be an armchair cricketer, right? You can just sit here and say, yaar, Kohli ne aise karna chahiye tha. But converting that into action and being able to pull it off is something that you have to prove yourself in. So if you say that, oh, I've actually done these activities, then people will take your internship applications a lot more seriously. Okay. And that said, growth is a very small group. There are 3 faculty members in growth. Okay. But there are several hundred astronomers in India. Okay. So the Astronomical Society of India has more than, I think, a couple of thousand members. So there are a lot of other opportunities that are also going to be available for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask one question.
Yes.
So in the one of your slides, you had talked about the gravitational wave event of the binary neutron star, which you all did not detect.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that you all had about a crore or something of possible triggers, and you all reduced it to some 5 of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering how was that even done, and what was special in those 5? Why I couldn't see anything much in those because.
Okay, maybe I should share my screen again and show that, and we'll look at it again and try to understand whether there is something special. Okay. Okay. Let's jump to that slide. Here. Okay. So these are the ones that we have done follow up on, and these are the ones that we haven't. Okay. So this one in particular was a very weak event, and there was the sky area of this event was too large for us to be able to do follow up with Growth India directly. Same about this one, actually same about this one as well. Okay, but the difference here was that this one was followed up by a bunch of other observatories, and they gave us candidates for detailed follow-up. Okay, this one, if I remember correctly, one of these two was actually just too close to the sun, so it was not worth following up there. So the choices made were on the basis of, so some of them were rejected because the sky, so this one, for example, at the bottom, sky area was too large. One of them, I think, was rejected because it was too close to the sun. One was rejected simply because of bad weather. We wanted to observe. So right now, for example, I was going to put in a picture, but I forgot at the end. There's snow in Hanle, okay, and there's snow on top of the dome. So we can't observe even if we want to. So there are various factors about, or whether there is any other high priority campaign that we are doing, and so on. So those are the factors that come in as practical matters when deciding what we want to observe and what we cannot observe.
Right. Actually, my question was about the one where you all specifically followed up and reduced and had so many possibilities, and you all reduced it to 5 or something.
So we can image, order of tens of square degrees of the sky. Okay, and that particular event actually had concentrated probability in 10 square degrees of the sky, or not 10, more like 25, 30 square degrees. So that is what allowed us to do the detailed follow-up over there. The other events were more spread out. So see, the other part which we have to look at is that this is also a partnership. So we want to distribute things to make sure whatever telescope is best suited for a task does that task. So the other 6 events, which I did not give you as case studies here, we have dozens of images taken for those as well. Okay, but for this particular event at that particular time, we were the only telescope in the network that could have covered that large part of the sky close to the North Pole. At that point, ZTF had a pointing limitation which just didn't allow it to look at the North Pole. So that is why that responsibility came upon us. Okay, so as a large collaboration, and that's the beauty of science. Okay, science is built on collaboration. There is enough to learn about the universe that everyone can get a share, everyone can benefit from it. So we get together, we often have a telecon to decide who should be doing what, and then on the basis of that, we set about knowing fully well that everyone is doing this together.
Okay, so I think it's already over time. So thank you, sir, very much for your talk. And I hope everyone enjoyed this. I'll stop recording now.
Most welcome. Nice to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks.